It all started on a morning that seemed like any other. I'd arrived early as always, coffee on the table, reports ready, goals met. The hallway was quieter than usual, but that never meant anything. At least, that's what I thought. Until the email arrived. Strategic Alignment Meeting, Room 3. It was a fancy name for an ambush. When I walked in, everyone's faces were tense but smiling. Matt, the new operations manager, greeted me with that look that mixes contempt and condescension. And then he started talking about internal reorganization, resource optimization, functional redundancy, beautiful in PowerPoint, cruel in real life. My position was being eliminated to make way for a new, more agile, more connected, more innovative model. It wasn't about me, they said. It was about the company's future. But it was impossible not to see that it was all just an excuse, a rehearsed corporate script to disguise a premeditated elimination. As Matt poured out his empty words, something inside me burned. It wasn't just indignation, it was clarity. The clarity of someone who realizes they're being discarded out of convenience, not necessity. I saw it in his eyes. He thought I was outdated, that my experience was a liability, not an asset, that this company, built in part on my own effort, now needed new blood. And by new blood, he meant someone more manipulable, cheaper, easier to mold into the fragile mold of his ego. They used sweet words to hide the bitter taste of injustice. But I knew this game. I'd seen it before with former colleagues who disappeared overnight. The difference was that with me, they didn't know who they were dealing with. The room fell silent after he finished speaking, not because no one had anything to say, but because everyone there knew the truth, even if they didn't admit it. The HR manager lowered her eyes, embarrassed. The two supervisors next to me exchanged nervous glances. And me? I just took a deep breath, because in that moment something inside me broke, and at the same time, something awakened. They were pulling me out of there like dead weight. But little did they know they were stripping away the last layer of loyalty I had for that company. Loyalty was gone, and in its place was born something colder, more calculated. I didn't beg, I didn't cry, I didn't ask to stay. I signed the papers as calmly as one writes a sentence, but not mine, theirs. That day the word efficiency was used so often it lost its meaning. They talked as if the company was evolving, as if cutting people was the same as cutting fat. But they forgot that not all meat is fat. Some parts are vital muscle, and they were about to discover that cutting me was more than a mistake. It was a cut to the very heart of the system. Matt insisted on walking me to the door as if he wanted to see my face when he left. His smile was full of relief, as if he had won some silent battle. But what he didn't know was that the war was just beginning, and that, unlike him, I didn't need to shout to win. As I descended the elevator, cardboard box in hand, I thought about everything I had built there. Years of dedication, sleepless nights, problems solved before anyone noticed, everything thrown away with a prepared speech and a signature. But there, on that silent descent, a seed was planted. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew it wouldn't end there. They had left me out of their new plan. They had dismissed me as if I were invisible, irrelevant. But they had forgotten one small detail. What made me invisible to them was exactly what made me dangerous. And they would eventually find out the hard way, because when you step on a snake, you better be sure it's dead. And I was very much alive. Matt didn't know the company's history. He had come from outside, brought in by investors who only saw numbers in columns and graphs. He had no idea who built the processes, who created the systems, who developed the partnerships that kept the place afloat. To him, everything that came from before was obsolete, and I, in his imagination, was a remnant of that past, an old name on a payroll, a cost to be eliminated. He saw my presence as a delay to the innovation he wanted to implement. But what Matt ignored, and this was the mistake that doomed him, is that there are things that don't show up in reports, things that sustain a company from within, that can't be erased with a layoff. My name wasn't just on the badge. It was engraved in the very roots of that corporation. I wasn't just another employee. I was responsible for a process no one else understood. When I joined years ago, the company was going through a serious compliance crisis. Months were spent reorganizing contracts, understanding international standards, securing certifications. I remember the stacks of documents, the calls with regulatory agencies, the endless meetings with lawyers and technicians, and how, in the end, I was the one who signed the agreement that allowed the company to operate in restricted markets with a single license, registered in my name, as required by law at the time. a detail that was lost over time, buried amid the changes and negligence of those who came after. I never spoke about it. It wasn't necessary. Until now. Matt never bothered to investigate what made each area actually work. For him, it was enough to implement a new system, replace 2 or 3 managers, put buzzwords in emails, and voila, digital transformation. But transformation without memory is destruction. And he had no idea that by firing me, he was removing the only person who knew how to renew the master operating license, which required periodic updating. It was a technical, specific process that depended on credentials that only I possessed, and which were never transferred because no one ever thought they would be necessary. They were so concerned with appearing modern that they forgot to check if they still had permission to exist. When you work for years in silence, people think you're easily replaceable. They don't realize that your absence is like removing a pillar from a building. It may not seem like it at first, but soon everything begins to crumble. I watched from afar, silently, as the first signs appeared, small and almost imperceptible to those who don't know what to look for. A returned form, a denied request. An external system went offline due to regulatory data inconsistency. No one connected it to my departure, yet. But to me it was clear. The structure was beginning to shake, and the most ironic thing, I could have warned them. I could have fixed it. But why would I do that for someone who treated me like recyclable waste? Matt prided himself on making rational decisions. He called himself a surgical leader, but his arrogance blinded him. He underestimated my importance because he mistook humility for weakness. He thought that because I didn't make a point of showing up, I was worthless. That because I didn't raise my voice in meetings, I didn't understand what was at stake. He believed the legacy I left was fragile, but he forgot that a true legacy doesn't disappear with a signature. It simply hides until the time is right to return, and when it does, it doesn't ask permission. There was a clause, hidden in the footnote of the original international partnership agreement we signed years ago, at a time when the company was barely able to keep the lights on. It was a legal safeguard clause, created as a requirement of a European regulatory body, and ironically, or perhaps intuitively, it was placed under the sole responsibility of the person who organized the entire approval process, me. This clause stated, subtly but directly, that any attempt to operate the systems associated with that license, without the renewal authorized by the technical manager, would result in automatic suspension of the general permission to operate in foreign territory. It was a legal lock, and I was the key. During all the years I was there, this clause never needed to be activated. I handled everything personally, renewing the terms, submitting the necessary documents, and keeping everything in order with almost invisible diligence. But now that I was no longer there, no one had any idea about this requirement. They hadn't read the original contract. Neither had Matt. He boasted about knowing the new guidelines, but he never understood the fundamentals behind the structure. For him, it was enough to simply press buttons and digitally sign, but that wasn't a button. It was a detonator, and it was about to be activated. 3 months after my departure, the renewal period arrived, as it always did. The system sent alerts, but they were ignored. The new managers thought it was just another standard check. No one responded to the regulatory agency's emails. No one knew how to access the portals. The passwords were saved only on my old device, which had been returned and archived carelessly. And then the deadline passed. And the clause was fulfilled. Operations suspended. Systems blocked. Contracts frozen. But the downfall didn't happen all at once. It came like a silent crack in the hull of a giant ship, which begins to take on water without anyone noticing, until it's too late. The ironic thing was that all of this was perfectly documented and accessible. You just had to know where to look, and of course, what to look for. But when you take someone like me out of the equation, you lose more than just an employee. You lose a map, a guide who could have prevented the shipwreck, and this wasn't an accident. It was arrogance. It was contempt. Matt believed that a consultancy would solve everything. He even hired experts, spending fortunes on diagnostics that revealed nothing, because the systems weren't faulty. They were obeying exactly what the clause stipulated, a total lockdown until further notice, from the only person with legal authorization, me. I remember laughing to myself when I saw the first article appear. Corporation X faces delays in international operations due to technical failure. Technical, they said. What a lovely euphemism. The failure wasn't technical. It was moral. It was the direct result of disregarding the memory of a house while trying to modernize only its facade. And what made me smile the most was knowing that all of this had been planted years ago with no intention of revenge. It was merely a protective mechanism. But now, it served as the first step in a justice that was being carried out with almost poetic precision. Matt was radiant. I'd never seen the man so pleased with himself. He walked the halls like a general after a conquest. His speeches at meetings bordered on triumphalism. "We're entering a new era," he'd say. "We've gotten rid of the bottlenecks of the past," he'd add. And each sentence was for me a subtle reminder that justice always begins with the villain's inflated ego. He didn't just believe he'd done the right thing, he boasted about it. My departure was, in his view, a trophy, something that would prove his competence to the board and investors. Little did he know, he'd just sawed his own throne apart. The day I signed my resignation, he looked at me like someone driving the final stake into the heart of an old problem. His smile was one of victory. But mine was a puzzle. It wasn't despair. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of dark peace. That look you get when you know the enemy has just stepped into the trap, but you still think you're on safe ground. While he boasted about restructuring the team and optimizing processes, I left silently, but with one detail no one noticed: a copy of the original contract, legally stored in my custody, and with it, the proof of everything, that he had removed the only piece capable of keeping the game running. The following days were filled with celebration for him. Integration parties, LinkedIn posts with hashtags about innovation, invitations to speak at management events. He was being treated like a visionary. He was featured in industry magazines, received interviews, and received public accolades. Everything seemed to indicate he had made the right decision. But decisions aren't measured at the time they're made, but in the trail they leave. And Matt's trail was already starting to stink, even if he didn't realize it yet. Like every corporate narcissist, he mistook silence for acceptance. But there was only the stillness before the storm. The internal team began to feel it, at first subtly. A form that wouldn't load, a credential request that returned with a validation error, an international provider that could no longer access the certification platform. Everything was too minor to seem serious. But to me it was the sound of a time bomb ticking away. They tried to resolve it, of course, but without knowing what was causing the errors, they could only erase the symptoms, without addressing the root cause. And the root cause was there, hidden under the guise of redundancy. Each error was a reminder that you can't delete a story without paying the price. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my life, quietly, yes, but with firm steps. I moved away from the pain, the resentment, and turned every memory into fuel. They didn't know it, but by letting me go, they also freed me. And nothing is more dangerous than someone who's been wronged, with the time, information, and motivation to fight back. Matt's false sense of victory was for me the perfect trailer for a tragedy waiting to happen, because the fall that hurts the most is the one that comes when you're at the top, convinced you'll never fall. At first, no one thought it was a big deal. Access to the European server went down one morning. Some kind of instability, they said. They called the IT team, rebooted the system, and everything was back on track for a few hours. The next morning, a bid request was cancelled due to lack of valid certification. An administrative error? Maybe. But that afternoon, 3 international clients simultaneously froze contracts. Protocols not in compliance, the report said. And it was at this point that the chaos began to exude an unmistakable smell, that of something irreparably rotten. The meetings multiplied. Emergency, urgent. Everyone was trying to understand what was happening. The emails carried the same frantic tone. Does anyone know where the renewal documents are? Who is the current technical manager? Where are the old credentials? The answer was always the same. Dana was taking care of that. But Dana was no longer there, and the new team didn't even know where to begin. External systems that depended on the license began denying connections. Automated integrations crashed. International compliance platforms lacking renewal reports began classifying the company as unauditable, a technical detail for some, but fatal for those who depend on their reputation. The board tried to remain calm. It's a transitional phase. Everything will work itself out, they said in internal communications, but those on the front lines knew. It was deeper, it was structural, and most terrifying. They didn't know how to fix it. Because it wasn't just about accessing a system or signing a form, It was a cycle that I had managed so meticulously and seamlessly that any attempt to replicate it without understanding the underlying logic was like trying to reconstruct a jigsaw puzzle without knowing the final image. Meanwhile, deadlines continued to creep up. Week after week, more tasks fell through. Contracts expired. Payments were blocked by foreign banks demanding registration updates signed by a legal representative, a position that technically had been vacant since my dismissal. And then came the breaking point. The international platform suspended operations at its European branch. This meant millions in losses, unfulfilled commitments, and customers migrating to competitors. The board despaired. Matt lost his footing. And what he had so feared finally revealed itself. His new era was crumbling brick by brick. And me? I watched from afar. Now in a different city, a different routine, a different life. But it was impossible not to see the news. The company trying to cover up the crisis, journalists speculating about the causes, former employees exchanging messages in group messages. To many, it seemed like bad luck, an unfortunate series of technical errors. But to me, it was justice acting silently, meticulously, irreversibly. Nothing was forced, nothing was illegal. It was simply a consequence, the law of return acting with surgical precision, and it all began with a simple gesture, a dismissal disguised as modernization, a mistake they would never be able to undo. Matt's facade of confidence began to crack the moment he was asked to provide answers. Not prepared reports, not sound bites. Real answers, technical, legal, operational. In an extraordinary meeting called by the presidency, he was called to explain the sudden collapse of international systems. For the first time, his PowerPoint slides weren't enough. His promises that everything was under control disintegrated with a single question. Who is currently the technical legal representative for the operating license? Silence. Neither he nor anyone on the team knew. The question seemed simple, but in that moment, Matt was exposed, not as a leader, but as an actor who rehearsed the role without understanding the script. The arrogance that had sustained him vanished in seconds. His haughty gaze gave way to an expression of barely concealed panic. He was scanning the papers in front of him for names, as if hoping for a magical signature to solve the mess he'd gotten himself into. This was handled by the previous team, he tried to justify, but the board's eyes no longer reflected respect. They reflected doubt, fear, anger. It was in that instant that they realized Matt wasn't the solution, he was the mistake. And not a technical error, an error of character, of judgment, of leadership. Because a leader who doesn't understand the fundamentals of what he's in charge of is nothing more than a well-dressed imposter. The following weeks were a parade of silent humiliations. The hastily hired outside consultancy firm confirmed what was already suspected. The license had expired and could not be renewed without the intervention of the former manager, a detail that, inexplicably, had not been anticipated during the transition. Why didn't anyone document this process, they asked. How did this slip past the new management? The answer was as simple as it was devastating. Matt believed he knew better than everyone else. And at the height of his self-confidence, he ignored what truly mattered. He disregarded experience, institutional memory, and the legal framework. The house of cards he had built began to crumble before everyone's eyes, and it didn't take long for the press to find out. The story was subtle but accurate. Executive ignores vital technical clause and puts international operation at risk. His name was there, in the penultimate line, but it was enough for the market to notice. And that was enough for early investors to begin withdrawing support. The image of an innovative manager became a backroom joke. Former colleagues avoided him in the hallways. The sycophants of old now whispered behind his back. The exposure didn't come with scandal. It came with abandonment, the loneliness of failure. And perhaps that was the cruelest punishment, being ignored by those who once exalted him. Meanwhile, I was discreetly approached by some people who had previously ignored me. People from the boardroom, lawyers, business partners who wanted to better understand what had happened. I listened to them patiently. I responded politely, but I didn't rush, because revenge isn't served hot. It matures over time. And in that moment, it was just right. Matt was now just a distorted reflection of the image he'd tried to project. And even if he tried to rebuild his reputation, the damage was already done. Because no amount of marketing can erase the smell of exposed incompetence. He wasn't a leader, never was. It just took them a while to realize it. It was a normal morning, until the company doorman announced the arrival of a team of 9 people wearing ties, briefcases, and credentials, bearing an acronym everyone knew, but few wanted to see up close. International Regulatory Compliance Audit. No meeting had anticipated the visit. No email announced the inspection. Because serious audits don't send invitations. They arrive. And when they arrive unexpectedly, it's because they already know what they're looking for, and they already know they'll find it. The meeting room was transformed into an interrogation room. Documents began to be requested. Renewal records, current certificates, proof of going concern. The same documents that had been under my former responsibility. One by one, the current managers were summoned. One by one, they fell apart. Disorganized paperwork, incomplete files, lack of procedures. "Who was the last technical manager registered in this system?" asked one of the auditors, her tone so neutral it was almost threatening, and the response was silence, until someone murmured, "Dana." And that's when everything began to fall apart, with my name echoing at the center of a scandal. Matt was called last. His face, once tanned and confident, now seemed drained of color. His hands were shaking. His papers were crumpled. He tried to make a speech, justifying the difficult transition, citing internal changes and modernization processes. But the auditors weren't there to hear excuses. They were there to gather evidence. In less than 2 hours, they concluded, the master operating license had expired, and according to the registered clause, all contracts associated with it were technically illegal. The projected fines exceeded 6 figures. The suspension could last months. And most seriously, the responsibility fell on the manager who authorized my departure. Without guaranteeing the transfer of legal responsibility, the room became a battleground. The board, once Matt's defenders, now confronted him with furious eyes. "Did you know about this? How could you let this happen? Why wasn't anyone informed?" But it was too late. The bomb had already exploded. And I was drinking coffee at that moment, literally, sitting in a cafe near the new building where my new project was starting. The phone rang. It was a familiar number. I didn't answer. Not then, because I wanted to savor every minute of what was happening, the collapse not as revenge, but as pure justice. Because in the end, what the audit did was simply reveal what was always there, the truth. The final inspection report was devastating. It highlighted gross negligence, leadership failures, the absence of a technical succession plan, and most importantly, the deliberate omission of crucial data. It wasn't just incompetence, it was mismanagement. And Matt's name was there, not as a victim, but as someone directly responsible. The company lost contracts, accounts were frozen, and it had to release an official statement acknowledging the error. The news spread like wildfire. Industry websites, social media, WhatsApp groups. The man who presented himself as an innovator was now synonymous with administrative scandal. There was no arrest, but there was something even worse. The complete destruction of credibility. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. I just waited for time and the truth to do their work. The audit spectacle was the crowning achievement of my patience. They thought they had wiped me off the map, but they forgot that some marks can't be erased. They are records, contractual, legal, moral. And when the stage is set, the truth doesn't just appear, it shines. I never planned on taking revenge, at least not the way the movies portray it. I didn't imagine storming meetings, yelling, demanding my place back. My revenge was built in silence, with strategy, with time, and most of all with self-confidence. Because true power isn't in retaliating with anger, it's in growing so solidly, so flawlessly, that your very existence becomes an affront to those who tried to erase you. And that's exactly what happened. While they wallowed in investigations, explanatory notes, and pathetic attempts to put out the fire they created, I rose. Without fanfare, without asking permission. After my dismissal, I didn't chase jobs. I was sought out. A former partner from years ago contacted me after hearing what had happened. They were setting up a new operation, focusing on strategic licensing and international regulations. They needed someone experienced, someone who had dealt with real complexity, not just spreadsheets. Within a few weeks, I took over as a senior consultant and soon after, as technical director. A title that had never interested me before, but now made sense. Not out of vanity, but because it came with autonomy, respect, and, ironically, the attention of the same clients who had previously belonged to Matt's company. I never publicly announced my new position. I never made provocative posts. I just let time take care of the work. And it did. The large contracts that had previously belonged to the old company began to migrate, one by one. Clients who no longer trusted the disorganized structure and who remembered fondly how everything worked when I managed the processes. They didn't want modern managers. They wanted security, efficiency, results. And whoever offered that now was my new home. And seeing it happen, seeing the names change hands, seeing the silent praise being sent via email was more gratifying than any public applause. Matt knew. Of course he knew. He knew customers were leaving. He knew market reports indicated a decline in confidence. And he knew I was engaging with the competition, though never directly or unethically, just following my path, better than before. And that ate away at him, because his downfall wasn't caused by an external attack. It was the absence of someone he considered disposable, and my rise didn't require active revenge. My presence was enough, the memory of what I represented, the living confirmation that quiet competence always trumps noisy ego. I remember one specific day. I was in a meeting with new partners when I saw on one of their laptop screens the news of Matt's company's latest restructuring, cuts, mergers, desperate attempts to regain credibility. He had been reassigned, a fancy term for demoted without scandal. I smiled, not out of malice, but because I understood justice was served not when he lost, but when I won without having to step on it. My promotion wasn't meant to humiliate anyone. It was meant to silently demonstrate that no one can erase someone of value. They can only delay their shine. Matt didn't fall all at once. He crumbled in stages, like every corporate tyrant who lived surrounded by sycophants but never built true alliances. The first loss was the board's trust. They didn't fire him outright. They did something worse. They removed him from the front lines. They stripped him of his autonomy. They cut off his access to key projects. He became a consultant instead of a decision-maker. A subtle but devastating detail for someone addicted to control. The second loss came in the form of isolation. Colleagues who once vied for his time now avoided his presence. Conversations fell silent when he entered. Greetings became only distant nods. He became invisible. The room where he once presided over packed meetings was replaced by a standard workstation in a corner away from the windows. A clear symbol. He was no longer important. His subordinates now answered to different names. New faces took their places at the surrounding tables, and all he could do was watch, helplessly, as the foundations he pretended to control were rebuilt without his participation. He tried to react. He tried to make himself useful, but it was too late. His word was no longer valuable. His presence was uncomfortable, because everyone knew he had caused the greatest institutional damage in the company's history, and there was no way to erase that. A former colleague from my department once called me, just to tell me, in that tone that mixed surprise and justice, that Matt had been placed on extended strategic leave, in effect, a forced separation. They would pay his salary, but they wanted distance, and the most symbolic part of all this was how he reacted. He tried to deny it. He said it was part of a repositioning plan. He posted an optimistic message on LinkedIn, feigning control. But those who understood what was going on behind the scenes knew he wasn't leaving by choice. He was being removed, like a tumor that could no longer be ignored, not because it was dangerous, but because it was no longer useful. And then came the final blow, oblivion. No one spoke his name in meetings anymore. New employees didn't even know who he was. His leadership stint became a footnote. The major projects he so extolled had been transferred. His former allies, now promoted, didn't mention him. And most painfully, the new management had restored the international operation, with my guidance from the outside, in a consultative capacity. Matt watched it all unfold, alone, powerless, without credit, without a voice. A spectator to a reality he once pretended to control. And what hurt the most wasn't losing his position, it was losing respect. Because power is regained. Reputation, not always. Especially when the world discovers that behind all his arrogance, there was just one man who built his authority on the elimination of the one who truly sustained everything. He wasn't overthrown by a coup. He was abandoned by everyone. And that kind of downfall is the cruelest. Because when the last person to believe in you is yourself, and even that faith is exhausted, there's nothing left. Only the echo of wrong choices. My victory didn't come with trophies, spotlights, or headlines. It came with stares, with silences, with 7 a.m. emails from former partners saying, "We're ready to migrate with you." It came with contracts that were once out of my reach. now being offered without my asking, with invitations to events where I was once just a spectator, and now I was the keynote speaker. The company that fired me for redundancy saw its main client base migrate, little by little, like sand slipping through your fingers, and there was no need for revenge. It was just positioning, strategy, consistency. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I didn't need to invent lies or hatch conspiracies. I simply remained who I always was, competent, discreet, ethical. While they wasted time on power plays, I built solutions. While they spent fortunes trying to put out fires, I offered predictability. While they lost clients, I gained trust. One by one, the pillars of the market began to turn to me, and before I knew it, I was no longer the wronged ex-employee. I was a reference, I was a solution, and the sweetest irony, those who doubted me now had to deal with my shadow because all the paths that once led through them now led through me. Matt, of course, tried to get back on his feet. He appeared in a few side projects. He tried to sell himself as a restructuring expert, but the market is smaller than it seems, and memories are longer than he imagined. There was always someone at the table who remembered the crisis, the audit, the losses, and the name involved in it all, his. Meanwhile, I expanded. My new company grew. We hired good people, people who, like me, had been discarded by leaders who mistook age for obsolescence. And together, we created something solid, human, strategic, something that didn't depend on ego but on truth. There is no greater glory than taking back what they tried to rip from you and transforming it into something even stronger. I didn't want revenge. I wanted space. And when they closed a door on me, they thought they silenced me. But without realizing it, they pushed me onto a bigger, freer path. And it was on this path that I grew, that I flourished. They fired me, thinking they had won. But I won when I refused to be shaped by resentment. I won when I chose to build instead of destroy. I won when I transformed rejection into strength. And today, I am living proof that justice exists, not in shouting, but in consequences. And perhaps if you've made it this far, this story has touched you. Perhaps because you too have been discarded, underestimated, or humiliated. If so, know this. This doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do with it. You can remain silent, or you can transform pain into power. May this story inspire you to never settle for less than you deserve, to never doubt your worth, and above all to understand that time may seem cruel, but it is truth's greatest ally. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like. It shows that it's worth continuing to tell stories like this. Comment below. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew everything? Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that the tables can turn, and when they do, they turn beautifully. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Here every week justice finds its voice.